In 1945, at a quiet POW camp in rural Colorado, something happened that no American guard, no German prisoner, and no government official could have predicted. A German prisoner of war, a man who had every reason to hate America, ended up risking everything to protect an American child, an orphaned 6-year-old boy who wandered into the camp gates on a freezing January morning. The friendship that followed defied every wartime rule, and the secret behind it would not be revealed for over 60 years. This is the incredible true story of Jakob Reiner, the POW who became a guardian, and Daniel Hayes, the boy who changed his life forever. Jakob Reiner was 32 years old when he was captured in North Africa in 1943. He wasn't a Nazi loyalist. He wasn't a cruel soldier. He was a schoolteacher from Hamburg, drafted against his will, fighting a war he never believed in. At the camp, the Americans noticed something strange about him. He never complained. He never fought with other prisoners. He never caused trouble. He just often sat alone, writing quietly in a small notebook. Most of the other POWs assumed he was writing letters home, like everyone else. But he wasn't. He was writing stories for children, fairy tales, poems, lessons. He was capturing memories of the life he once had, and the future he hoped the world would one day offer again. The camp in Colorado was peaceful compared to the battlefields of Europe. Guards treated the POWs fairly. The prisoners worked on local farms, chopped wood, repaired buildings, and even produced goods for the war effort. But the winter of 1945 was brutal. Temperatures dropped below freezing for weeks on end. Snow piled high, and the camp became a quiet island of routine, far removed from the war. Jakob's barracks were at the far end of the camp, right near the fence, the coldest part of the entire facility. Every night, he sat by candlelight, writing in his notebook. He wrote about hope. He didn't know that soon someone else would need that hope far more than he did. One morning, the guards found a small set of footprints in the snow, leading towards the outer area of the camp. They followed them and discovered something no one expected. A small boy, maybe 6 years old, was standing alone near the fence. He was shivering, thin, and had no coat. A guard knelt down. "Son, where are your parents?" he asked gently. The boy whispered, "Mommy's gone, Daddy's gone." And that was all he said. He had no name tag, no address, no records. A local officer identified him only as Daniel, a boy whose parents had died in a winter accident just days earlier. He had wandered off in confusion. They brought him into the camp office, trying to warm him up, but Daniel wouldn't speak. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't even look at anyone. Until Jakob walked by. The boy lifted his head. Their eyes met. And for the first time, Daniel whispered, "You look like my papa." Jakob froze. The guards stared, completely surprised. And that's where everything began. The regulations were clear. Prisoners of war were forbidden from interacting with American civilians, especially children. But Daniel refused to be near anyone except Jakob. He cried when guards tried to separate them. He screamed when a doctor approached. But when Jakob slowly extended his arms, Daniel ran right into them. It was a moment no one expected. A German POW holding a lost American child, gently comforting him. The camp commander hesitated and said quietly, "Keep them together." Just until the boy calms down. No one knew it would become more than a single day. Much, much more. Daniel wouldn't eat for anyone. He sat silently in the small infirmary, his body trembling, staring down at his own hands. This terrified the American officers. A malnourished child needed immediate care, but their gentle offers of food were met with a silent, fearful refusal. From the barracks, Jakob watched. He knew he was breaking protocol, but he couldn't just stand by. He took the piece of warm bread he had saved from his own meager ration and walked slowly toward the boy. Kneeling down so he was at Daniel's eye level, he offered the bread. "Daniel, he said softly, using the German word first. Essen? Eat? The boy's gaze flickered up for just a moment. Seeing the hesitation, Jakob tore a small piece of the bread and ate it himself, showing Daniel it was safe. Slowly, a small, grimy hand reached out. Daniel took the bread, and after a long pause, took a bite. It was the first thing he had eaten in nearly 2 days. The American guards watched the scene in complete silence. Something was happening here that went beyond the war, beyond their uniforms and their orders. It was an act of pure, simple humanity. Over the next days, which soon turned into weeks, Jakob and Daniel became inseparable. A new routine formed, a small island of peace in a sea of conflict. Every morning, Jakob would use scraps of wood to carve little toys for Daniel, a tiny horse, a bird, a spinning top. The boy followed him everywhere, a small shadow in an oversized coat. The presence of the child softened the entire camp. Other prisoners of war, men who had seen the worst of humanity, started saving small treats from their own rations for him. A piece of chocolate, a spoonful of sugar. Even the guards, initially wary, began to smile. One day, a guard leaned against a post, watching Jakob hoist Daniel onto his shoulders. He chuckled and said, "Rainer, you've adopted him." Jakob looked down, a profound sadness in his eyes. He replied quietly, "He saved me first." Weeks passed, and with each passing day, a little more of the shell around Daniel cracked. He started speaking more, first in single words, then in short, hesitant phrases. And that's when something truly astonishing happened. One evening in the mess hall, Daniel pointed a small finger at the breast pocket of Jakob's uniform. He whispered, just loud enough for Jakob to hear, "You wrote stories." Jakob froze, his blood running cold. No one in this camp knew about his notebook. It was his last connection to the man he used to be, a writer, a dreamer. Daniel continued, his voice still a whisper. Papa reads stories. Just like yours." The guards nearby exchanged surprised glances. Jakob knelt down again, his voice careful. "Daniel, how do you know I write stories?" The boy simply pointed at the top of the worn leather notebook, which was sticking out ever so slightly from Jakob's pocket. For the first time in months, a genuine smile spread across Jakob's face. That night, he pulled out the notebook, and in a soft voice, he read a story to Daniel in gentle English, a children's tale he had written long ago, about peace and warm forests and a home filled with light. Daniel listened, his eyes wide, and eventually fell asleep right there, curled up in Jakob's lap. Their fragile world was shattered when the camp commander received official orders. Daniel was to be transferred to a state-run orphanage. When Jakob heard the news, he felt something inside him break. He knew what orphanages were like during wartime. Cold rooms, overcrowding, scarcity, and no stability. Daniel was a frightened child who had already lost everything. He couldn't lose this too. In desperation, Jakob went to the commander. He begged him, "Please, sir, let him stay, at least until spring. He needs someone familiar." The commander sighed, a deep, weary sound. He was a man burdened by the weight of war. He looked out his office window. In the yard, Daniel was sitting on Jakob's shoulders, laughing, his small hands tangled in Jakob's hair. It was a sight so pure, so full of life, that the war raging outside felt like it belonged to another universe entirely. The commander turned back from the window. After a long silence, he whispered, so quietly it was almost lost, "I'll pretend I didn't hear you ask." And so, Daniel stayed. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. A ceasefire had been declared, and the long, bloody conflict finally came to an end. Inside the walls of a POW camp in Maine, the news spread like wildfire. For most German prisoners, this was a moment of pure celebration. They were going home. They had survived. Laughter and shouts of joy echoed through the barracks. But one man, Corporal Jakob Schmidt, stood apart from the crowd, his face etched with a different kind of emotion. He wasn't celebrating. Instead, his gaze was fixed on a small 5-year-old boy named Daniel. Just a few months earlier, Daniel had been a ghost of a child, found half frozen and starving in the woods near the camp. He was an orphan, his parents lost to the chaos of the war. He was traumatized, silent, and deeply distrustful of everyone. It was Jakob who had slowly, patiently coaxed him back to life. He'd shared his own meager rations, told him fantastical stories he'd invented for his own children back in Germany, and carved him little wooden toys. He'd taught the boy to smile again, to trust again. Now, Daniel was a different child. Healthier, happier, he clung to Jakob's coat, his small hand gripping the fabric as if his life depended on it. Looking up at the tall German soldier, his eyes filled with fear. "You promised," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. "You promised you wouldn't leave me." Jakob's heart shattered. He knelt down, his own eyes welling with tears, and looked into the boy's frightened face. He was just a soldier, a prisoner of war. He had no power, no say in what happened next. He had a family of his own waiting for him in Hamburg, a wife and children who thought he might be dead. He had to go home. But how could he explain that to this child who had become like a son to him? "Daniel," Jakob began, his voice thick with emotion, "I have to go, but I will find you again. I swear it. This is not the end." Daniel didn't understand. He just shook his head, silent tears streaming down his cheeks. Even the American guards, who had watched this unlikely friendship blossom, turned away, wiping their own eyes. The war had taken so much from so many. It had destroyed cities, broken families, and stolen millions of lives. But in this one small corner of a desolate POW camp, it had also forged a bond so powerful, so pure, that not even the end of the war itself could break it. The day of departure arrived. It was a cold, bitter morning. A line of military trucks rumbled into the camp, ready to transport the German prisoners to the coast for their journey home. As Jakob was herded toward one of the trucks, he saw Daniel break free from the camp's caregivers and sprint across the muddy yard. The boy was shouting his name, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. A couple of guards gently caught him, holding him back as he struggled. Jakob's heart felt like it was being ripped from his chest. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook. It was his most prized possession. Inside were all the stories he'd written, the ones he'd told Daniel night after night. He pressed it into the hands of a guard. "Please, give this to him," he pleaded. The guard nodded and passed the notebook to the weeping child. As the truck door was slammed shut, Jakob caught one last glimpse of Daniel through the wooden slats. The boy was holding the notebook, his face a mask of grief. The truck lurched forward, and Daniel began to run alongside it, trying to keep up, his cries lost in the roar of the engine. He ran and ran, stumbling through the snow and mud, until he finally fell, a small, defeated figure in the vast, empty landscape. Through the gaps in the truck's wall, Jakob watched until he could see him no more, tears streaming down his own face, carving hot tracks through the grime. Leaving his own family for the war had been hard. But leaving this boy, this child he had saved and come to love, was the single most painful moment of his entire life. He had made a promise, and he had no idea if he would ever be able to keep it. Back in America, Daniel Hayes grew up in the foster care system. He was passed from one home to another, a quiet, withdrawn child who carried a secret treasure, a German soldier's notebook filled with stories of brave knights and magical forests. He read it over and over, the pages becoming soft and warm with time. It was the only link he had to the man who had shown him kindness in the darkest time of his life. For 60 years, Daniel wondered, did Jakob survive the journey home? Did he ever make it back to his family in Germany? And the question that haunted him most, did he ever think of the little American boy he left behind? Did he forget me? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Jakob Schmidt did make it home to Hamburg. He was reunited with his wife and children and resumed his life as a schoolteacher. He was a good father, a beloved teacher, but a part of him remained forever in that POW camp in Maine. He never, ever forgot the boy in the snow. For years, he dedicated himself to an impossible search. He wrote countless letters to the U.S. Army, to the Red Cross, to American orphanages, anyone he thought might be able to help him find Daniel. He described the boy, the camp, the time they had spent together, but the war had left chaos in its wake. Records were lost, and the world was busy rebuilding. His letters all went unanswered. A wall of silence stood between him and the boy he'd promised to find. Jakob Schmidt passed away in 1999 at the age of 87. While going through his belongings, his family found a box of old papers. Among them was a faded photograph of a small boy and a handwritten note. It read, "If you ever find out what happened to Daniel Hayes, tell him I kept my promise. I looked for him. I never stopped looking." The story could have ended there, a sad tale of a promise broken by time and distance. But it didn't. In 2005, Jakob's grandson, a young man who had grown up hearing stories about the American orphan his grandfather had loved, decided to take up the search himself. Armed with his grandfather's letters, a few fragments of the stories that Jakob had painstakingly rewritten from memory, and an unshakable sense of duty, he traveled to America. He followed the cold trail his grandfather had left, contacting historical societies and veterans groups. After months of dead ends and frustrating searches, he finally found him. Daniel Hayes, now a 66-year-old man, was living a quiet life in Colorado. The meeting was quiet, emotional. Jakob's grandson sat across from the man his grandfather had spoken of his entire life. "My grandfather," he said, his voice gentle. "He looked for you until the day he died. He never forgot you." For a moment, Daniel was silent. Then he stood up, walked over to an old wooden desk, and opened a drawer. Carefully, he lifted out a familiar leather-bound notebook. It was Jakob's original, preserved perfectly for 6 decades. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the young German man. "He saved my life," Daniel whispered. "He saved my childhood. I just always hoped he knew that." In that moment, 60 years of silence, of wondering, of waiting, came to an end. The two men embraced, the grandson of a German soldier and an American man, united by an extraordinary friendship born in the most unlikely of places. Jakob never got to see Daniel again. He never got to hear him say thank you. But in the years that followed, Daniel made sure the whole world knew. In interviews and articles about his incredible story, he always said the same thing. "Jakob Schmidt was the best man I ever knew. This is a story about a German POW and an American orphan. A story of a war that tried to tear them apart, and a promise that survived for 60 years. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest chapters of our history, the forces that truly shape us aren't armies or ideologies. They are the quiet, simple, and unbreakable acts of humanity that refuse to be extinguished." Thanks for watching. If you were moved by this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories from history.